Hi everyone. So thank you very much for joining us in the Media Research Group seminar today. I'm delighted that our very own Barbara Brownie, Dr. Barbara Brownie, Associate Dean of Academic Quality in the School of Creative Arts, is joining us today to talk about her research on zero gravity wardrobes. So very excited for this. If everybody could just keep their mics and cameras off until we get to Q&A at the end, and that means Barbara gets full attention. Hi, Ian. Could you turn your camera off for us, please? Thank you. So if everybody just leaves their mics and cameras off, and I can go and hide myself as well so nobody has to look at me, and then Barbara gets the floor. Okay? Good stuff. Everybody ready? Let's go. Over to you, Barbara. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am going to attempt to share several different screens today because I got videos on YouTube and things, but I'm going to start with a PowerPoint. Can everybody, oh, it's cut off by this on the side of the screen. Can everybody see 85% of a PowerPoint?
Yes.
Brilliant.
We can see the PowerPoint.
Great, thank you. This is what I'm going to talk about today. Zero gravity wardrobes, in inverted commas, in the context of several things, mainly the expansion of the commercial space industry, but also the impact that that has had on popular culture, which has has led to more shows like these that you can see on the screen that are set in the near future and that anticipate plans for long distance manned space travel on a much larger scale than we've seen in the past, and an increased desire to and need to depict these things authentically. There is in the production values of these shows an implicit understanding that this is not going to be science fiction for much longer, and that makes authenticity that much more important. And because we now are beginning to understand that these kinds of journeys to Mars and so on are likely to happen in the not too distant future. So authenticity is become more urgent and more possible. And that's what I'm going to talk today is about that possibility and the reasons to exploit that possibility in the context of real life plans to go to space and the knock-on effect on film and TV. I have some disclaimers and a disclaimer and an apology. I am going to use the term zero gravity or possibly zero G. Colloquially, it is used and sometimes actually formally it's used, but it doesn't mean zero gravity. It actually means microgravity or free fall. So if you're inclined to pick up on my use of the word zero gravity, I don't actually mean zero gravity. I do mean microgravity. And an apology. Space is dark, so a lot of my images will be dark. If you're in a bright room, you might want to shut some curtains or something because you probably won't be able to see everything that I bring up on the screen, particularly some of the videos. They are a little bit dark. So getting into the main part of the presentation, we are now at the dawn of a commercial space age, and it is now possible for private companies, individuals to purchase a trip into space. There have been a number of space tourists already, a handful, but it's really looking like mass space tourism is going to happen soon. And it is also increasingly possible to depict authentic space-based environments, so extraterrestrial environments. There are a number of people, particularly Andrew Thorpe, have identified the potential for commercial space stations or commercial space travel to be a site not only for researchers conducting pure science experiments, but also for creative organizations such as film and TV production. You might be aware, for example, that Tom Cruise has just arranged to film a film aboard the International Space Station. So we're kind of really on the cusp of this stuff happening. There is, Tom Cruise is going to the International Space Station. He's training at the moment. is going to film a film in space. And the creative industry's involvement in space activities at the moment is kind of at that level where we are really beginning to think about actually doing it, and treating these orbiting space stations, the International Space Station at the moment, but possibly others in the future, as interdisciplinary venues, not just venues for space exploration, but venues for perhaps creative practice as well, including film and TV, including all sorts of technological, cultural, aesthetic things that might be happening in space. And of course, one particular attraction for space is as a site for science fiction, location for filming weightlessness and zero gravity or microgravity in particular, because it's something that we can't authentically replicate on Earth. The creative industries might have thought already quite a lot about the depiction of space and the universe, but they've still got quite a lot to learn about the conditions of weightlessness and how to exploit the possibility of using the condition of weightlessness for creative purposes. And my own research is mostly to do with fashion and clothing, so that's kind of the angle I'm generally taking today. And looking at this genre of what we call spacesuit films. Some spacesuit films have shown that the phenomenology of space travel is affected as much by the wearing of the spacesuit as by the state of weightlessness or the other conditions that you encounter in space. And if you are encased in a spacesuit, you're very much kind of immersed in this very specific environment that is not space, but rather is the environment of the spacesuit. And it makes the wearer hyper aware of their own physicality. Astronaut Chris Hadfield, that you might have seen on YouTube, describes the sound of the cooling fan that you always hear as your constant companion when you're wearing a spacesuit, and the liquid cooling ventilation that kind of churns around the side of your body. You hear your own breathing, you hear your own heartbeat. Basically, you are always aware of the physicality of your own body and the systems that are working to keep you alive. So those sounds are your constant companion the whole time you're in the spacesuit. So there's a physicality to the wearing of the spacesuit that is distinct from being in space, but also a key part of that environment. And we do see a fair amount of that in spacesuit films as well. We see, for example, a lot of heavy breathing going on inside the helmets. And those sounds are characterized by their closeness to the body, which is interesting in contrast to the huge, vast open space we see. So the astronaut is enclosed in a very close environment, and when we see spacesuit films, we often hear these sounds that are located within the environment of the spacesuit, which is very close and very small. And yet we see this visual landscape that is very big and very vast and very distant. And so there's a kind of claustrophobia, despite the openness of space that we see in spacesuit films. They communicate the claustrophobia of the spacesuit quite often orally through the sounds, in contrast to the vastness of space, by enhancing or drawing attention to that oral landscape, the sounds of the body, the sounds of the breathing. And sometimes you see, as in Gravity, this is a still from Gravity, the camera passing through the visor from open space and into the helmet. So you get this movement from outer open space into the small enclosed space of the helmet. And this is the kind of thing that we really think about when we think about costumes for films set in space. We think about spacesuits, and we think about technology, and we think about wearable technology and the astronaut that's enclosed in this high-tech bubble. But what we don't think about is what astronauts wear when they're actually on board spacecraft, which is a very different thing. And that is really actually where my research lies. If we think about not about the spacesuit, but about the clothes that astronauts wear when they're inside a spacecraft, they are much more ordinary clothes, what they call routine wear. And they are affected by microgravity, but they're not affected by open space. They're not in this big open void, which has cold temperatures and all sorts of other radiation and other concerns. They're really just affected by microgravity. Being inside a spacecraft is a little bit like being on a plane. It just happens that there's no gravity. So people on board a spacecraft don't need to be worried about the same kind of safety concerns that they have when they're out in open space in a spacesuit. So the concerns inside the spacecraft are different. Microgravity really is the key influencing factor then that we need to look at when we are looking at costume, if we're thinking about the inside of a spacecraft. And weightlessness obviously is a physical spectacle. It's something that space travelers feel, but for film it needs to be transformed into a visual spectacle. And obviously it can be made visual through the use of visible objects that are selected or designed to visibly respond in some way to weightlessness. And science fiction, film and TV often employs digital animation to do this, to simulate the effects of weightlessness on props, on actors' bodies. This is a scene from Passengers in which we've got a weightless body that's floating out of bed. Sometimes we see films that combine computer-generated effects with practical effects. So you might see, for example, people on harnesses combined with a little bit of special effects here and there, actors who are trained to look as though they're weightless and to move their bodies like that. I saw an interesting interview with Anne Hathaway in which she talked about the choreography of being trained to look like she was weightless by basically just kind of bouncing up and down like that. So there's a certain amount of practical effects and just acting that goes into making things look weightless. And occasionally they're used without any digital intervention. But we also see a weightlessness effect elsewhere as well. It's not necessarily just in films that are based in space. A weightlessness-like effect has applications in other genres as well. It's kind of haunting, and it has this near stillness that is quite ethereal. And so forms affected by weightlessness don't necessarily have to be located in space. There's other reasons to use the weightlessness effect if you're trying to express otherworldliness, or if you're trying to create this quite surreal, dreamlike effect. So you might also see it used in fantasy films. This is a clip from It, for example, which is definitely not set in space. And this is 300. And again, it's creating this otherworldly effect that's not science fiction, but fantasy, or case maybe just a dream sequence, something like that. So weightlessness as a physical environment has applications in sci-fi, but also in other kinds of settings as well. And it's something, therefore, that I think filmmakers need to engage with. Another reason why the film industry needs to start really engaging with it properly is the availability of high resolution footage from real space stations and the space industry, NASA, SpaceX, and so on. Now film things, they put that high resolution footage online, anybody can see it. And it means audiences are increasingly familiar with the real life effects of weightlessness. And therefore we are more able to recognize the kind of awkward uncanniness of digital or practical simulations of weightlessness. And the more we see this kind of footage, the real life footage of astronauts and footage of actual space travel, the more we are being inadvertently trained to recognize what the real effects of microgravity are, and becoming more expert at identifying when it's fake and when it's simulated. And actors, as I said, go a long way to, and filmmakers also go a long way to making sure that the movements are choreographed to make actors look like they are floating, like they're weightless, and to replicate the kind of motion that we've seen in astronauts as they float through the space station. But filmmakers don't really consider the finer details, and one of those finer details is the effect on costume and the way that clothes float around the body rather than hang from it. And it's a nice example of hoodie that you can see just here that's kind of floating up behind the astronaut's back or cosmonaut's back. Footage of actors and also astronauts in weightless conditions show us the extent to which clothing is one of the primary visible indicators of weightlessness. So if you see anybody in a weightless environment, particularly if they're not wearing skin-tight suits, which you often see on some sci-fi, they're wearing something that is a bit looser, like this polo shirt. One of the main ways in which we can identify this as an image of a weightless environment is the way in which her shirt kind of floats up, surrounds the body, but doesn't actually cling to it or hang from it in the way that we might expect in Earth gravity. And rigid objects that are so often used as props in films where there's a weightless environment do float around, but clothes do much more complicated things. The shape, the behavior of clothes is very different in weightlessness, and that's something that we need to look at, our filmmakers need to look at. It's all very well having a floating rigid object like a ball or a laptop that just kind of rotates around in space, but the effects of weightlessness on soft materials are quite a bit more complex. And those details, those small details, which are things like the effects of weightlessness on clothing, could contribute significantly to the feeling of authenticity in a microgravity scene. So what I'm arguing is that costume designers need to start studying this footage much more closely, or this real life footage that's filmed on board spacecraft, to understand the extent to which unconstrained fabric billows outwards rather than draping from the body, but also how weightless bodies are encountered at a variety of different orientations, exposing parts of clothing that we don't normally see and that are not normally substantially considered when designing costumes or clothing. Costume designers designing for real or simulated weightlessness really need to study these things, not just for the sake of authenticity, but also because the opportunities that commercial space travel presents for creative engagement with the effects of weightlessness, which actually, there's a lot of room for creative engagement with the effects of this as well. It's not just about authenticity, it can be about potential for creativity as well, and exploiting and just engaging with weightlessness in different ways. And hair, of course. There's a reason why so many actors cut their hair when they're doing a film set in space, because making hair look weightless is difficult. And anybody who's seen the first might have seen Sean Penn's hair that was gelled upwards, and it just looked slightly ridiculous. Simulating hair is just inefficient, and I think that's one of the reasons why they have short hair on film set in space. What I do hear from real life examples of people who've really been on zero-G flights, that one of the first things that people do if they got long hair is let their hair down, because it's one of the most interesting and exciting things to do if you're weightless, is to let your hair down if you've got long hair and just feel it kind of float around. So it's something that people recognize. People who have experienced weightlessness recognize that part of that experience is enhanced by just having your hair floating around your head. I'm going to look at 3 particular examples today, because there are very, very few examples of things filmed in a zero gravity environment. These 3 are pretty much the only ones that are worth that are of any significance. And none of these were actually filmed in space. They were all filmed on board reduced gravity flights. The availability and affordability of these reduced gravity flights does mean that the weightless environment is open to a lot more people now, and creates an opportunity for people to actually film in a weightless environment without going into space, and for a reasonable sum of money. And reduced gravity aircraft have provided locations for filming for Apollo 13, The Mummy, and also this OK Go music video, which I'm going to look at today. For Ron Howard, when he was filming Apollo 13, the location provided an opportunity to realistically replicate the physical conditions on board an Apollo spacecraft. Alex Kirkman directed The Mummy, and for him it was an opportunity to replicate what happens on an out of control aircraft when it falls towards the earth. And for OK Go, which is the last video on the right, microgravity was really used as a site for exploring the visual possibilities of having objects and performers just kind of floating around without gravity to constrain them. So 3 different motivations and 3 different approaches to filming in zero gravity in these 3 examples. And if we compare these to footage of real-life astronauts on board the International Space Station, what we get is a series of very different insights into how clothing behaves in microgravity, but also the limitations and what we haven't yet achieved in the film and TV industry. So I'm going to start with Apollo 13, and I will have a video in a minute if I can get that working. Apollo 13 made quite extensive use of reduced gravity aircraft throughout the film for flight sequences, and they were interspersed with close-up shots that were filmed on Earth. Of course, the close-up shots could be filmed on Earth because they could be just close up on a face and they didn't need to worry about things floating around in the background. And so they were able to authentically replicate the effects of weightlessness on the actors and props and costumes by actually really putting them in this weightless environment. If you watch enough footage of astronauts and if you study Apollo 13, you'll see a lot of the views that you see in this film, which you don't see in other films, are angles of the body that you just don't normally encounter on the screen. It's really difficult to maintain a location and an orientation if you are weightless. You kind of float around uncontrollably. And the crew reported having real problems just keeping the cameras where they were supposed to be and keeping control of props and cameras and lining everything up. So the crew recall basically everything just drifting, and there was very little control over it. And you can see that in the film because you see angles that, I mean, this is a good example here, the back of an actor, and yeah, all sorts of angles drifting into screen. And from a costume perspective, that means we are seeing angles on the clothes that we don't normally see. We might see shoulder seams, we might see backs more than we're used to seeing. At no time are the actors shown in an upright anatomical position. We never see the costume from the front in the silhouette view as we're used to seeing when we encounter somebody on the street, for example. So we see bits of costumes that costume designers don't normally think about because of the angles of the body. And we see more things like rear ends, an awful lot of bums, many rear ends and crotches. So bits of costume that you, as a costume designer, you probably don't think about because you're not expecting it to be prominent on the screen. And yet when you've got no control over where everything is floating, that happens. And I'm going to just, if I can get a film playing, I'm going to show you a significant clip. So this is something else that is worth exploiting, I think, as a filmmaker. In this scene, the astronauts become weightless for the first time as they float into space, and they take off their helmets and they take off their gloves. And as you can see, the helmets and the gloves don't fall to the ground. They are weightless, so they just kind of float around, and you see them rotating. You see that glove there rotates around, so you can see inside the glove and you can see outside the glove, and you see all these different angles of the helmet and all the different angles of the glove as they spin around and rotate in the air. And that is very much like a kind of showcase. You're showcasing the prop or the garment from all sorts of different angles as it revolves around in space. We are seeing inside, we're seeing outside, we're seeing the top with the bottom, all the angles. So there is an opportunity there to actually showcase a prop in a way that we might try to artificially rig on Earth, but just kind of happens automatically, naturally in the weightless environment. If you've got a prop and you want everybody to see the angle, just stick it up in the air in space and it will revolve around. So there's that opportunity for showcasing objects that I think needs to be exploited a lot more. Now, how do I go back? Okay. Next clip I'm going to show you is from The Mummy, if this works. Are you all still seeing the PowerPoint? Laura, can you confirm what are you seeing at the moment?
Yeah, we're good. We've got it.
You got the. You can see YouTube, can you?
I can. Yeah, I can
okay.
see the four panels. Yeah.
No, that's not what I wanted to see.
Sorry. Yes.
No, just the PowerPoint. Right. So I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to go to somewhere else. Right. Can you now see YouTube?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to turn off the sound and talk over this. So what we got here is a film in which a plane is just about to go down. And as it hurtles down towards Earth, it enters free fall, which is the same thing you actually get on a reduced gravity aircraft or in the International Space Station, which creates the effect of weightlessness. And as the plane falls down, here you go, the actors become weightless. And this was shot on board a reduced gravity aircraft over many, many different flights, and all kind of pieced together. And the sequence shows how garments that were not designed for the weightless environment are affected by the weightless environment. So these are clothes that were designed to drape downwards, but here are billowing outwards. And I might just go back a little bit to show you some of that a bit more clearly. What we've got here is things like a jacket, two jackets that were designed to hang downwards, and they become a bit more like capes, and they float up, exposing the actors' backs, almost losing control of where they're, the actors lose control of their clothes as much as they lose control of their own bodies. So clothes that are not tucked in, clothes that are loose, clothes that are not designed for the microgravity environment, behave in these unpredictable ways, possibly expose parts of the actors' bodies, particularly their backs. And so we see here the need to think about clothes as part of the planning for a scene that is filmed in zero gravity. I'm going to move on to, can you see another screen now? At the moment it's an Etsy advert.
Yeah, we're good.
Yep. Okay. So this is a slightly more prolonged sequence. This is an entire music video for OK Goes Upside Down and Inside Out. And this was a video that was constructed over a series of different flights, all kind of cut together. And it depicts band members as passengers on a plane, along with crew in uniform, and then various objects that are released into the plane as well. And a lot of these are everyday objects, so there's a lot of defamiliarization here, which is one of the, I think the main reasons for producing this video in this way. It's about making strange rather than about authentically depicting an action or an experience of being in space. The band members here are dressed in very ordinary clothing, so they're not dressed specifically for the weightless environment, and they've got just fully buttoned cardigans and things. And every so often you do see how the weightless environment has affected their clothes, the way that they kind of bunch up and lift away from the body. So you can see their back exposed, just as we saw with Tom Cruise in The Mummy. You see lots of soles of shoes there, because you see angles that we don't normally see. So the soles of the feet are something that possibly is not normally considered by costume designers, and yet you see them quite often when you are in the weightless environment. You might also see, if I jump forward a little bit, how cardigans kind of lift up a little bit. There you go. So you can see there a little extra lift in the collar and in the cardigan there, but it is fairly subtle. And the reason why it's fairly subtle is because these clothes are not, well, they're quite form-fitting. The only things that are really free-flowing there are the scarves on the flight attendants. So you get lots of different angles, and you can see some of the extra kind of volume that you get around the shoulders, and you see waists lifting up and exposing the back. But what I feel about this video is that they haven't exploited costume enough in thinking about the effects of weightlessness. I think that they spent an awful lot of time choosing all these interesting objects. They've got liquid, obviously, that they're releasing into weightlessness because they feel that those shapes are unfamiliar and interesting and create visual spectacle. But there is an opportunity for further visual spectacle in the costumes that they haven't exploited because they're wearing stuff that's quite form-fitting. So this gives you a sense of what happens to ordinary form-fitting clothes when they are weightless, but also doesn't quite go as far as I think it could in making the most of the creative potential of the weightless environment when you are using that weightless environment for creative purposes rather than for authentic depiction of space travel. Right, I should be back on the PowerPoint now. You stop me if you can't see PowerPoint.
You're good.
Good, okay. So 3 examples, the only 3 examples really, but there will be hopefully increasingly more, particularly now that SpaceX is ferrying people to the International Space Station. What we need to think about, or what the film industry needs to think about arguably, is the effects of, or how to turn this physical thing that is weightlessness into a visual spectacle, or into visual indicators of weightlessness. And that involves looking at or placing emphasis on the tactile qualities of clothes, resting upon brushing against the skin or not. One thing that we often see in film is other kinds of engagement with the tactile qualities of clothes and the relationship between clothes and the body. If we think about our everyday experience, almost constantly we're feeling the sensation of the clothes against our body. That is one of the things that reminds us that we are in this Earth environment, and we might not think about it, but that is this constant reminder that we are in Earth gravity because our clothes are resting on us. And therefore the relationship between body and the clothes and communicating that it contributes to an audience's sensorial immersion in a film. Harriet Parry writes about this in relation to the film Moon, although Moon obviously is not set in weightlessness, so it's not necessarily specifically about weightlessness. But she highlights the importance of costume in the production of haptic visuality, noting that the thingness of cloth simulates awareness of the thingness of the body. And when you're on Earth, that means the way that cloth shifts against the body is resting on the body. And there is a haptic and intuitive association between the skin of the subject on screen and our own skin. And if we consider those observations in the weightless environment, we have to consider how that relationship between skin and the body changes when we are weightless. It will be a key part of the audience's reading of weightlessness as it's depicted on the screen. And that will play a key part in enabling audiences to appreciate the physicality of the on-screen environment, weightlessness being a significant part of that physicality. So films that feature weightless environments where the skin comes out of contact with cloth or out of contact with the skin, depiction of that loss of contact with the clothes should be one of the ways in which films can communicate the phenomenology of weightlessness. Another author, Adriano Deola, which I hope I pronounced correctly, writing in response to examples like 2010, the year we made contact, and Mission to Mars, explores intangibility as an element of representation, particularly in spacewalk films, in these spacesuit films. So she writes about suspension in the void and how that is so significant in spacesuit films. We often see people floating through space, having lost contact with the thing that they were tethered to or clinging onto, and just kind of helplessly floating, suspended. And suspension is a key part of that space-like impression. And Deola takes a neurophenomenological approach that presents that as kind of core to the film viewing of these spacesuit films, a kind of intangibility that contrasts with the tangibility of being anchored on a surface. And from that standpoint, depiction of tactile sensation is essential in creating for the viewer a sensorial experience of being in contact or out of contact with something that's in your surroundings. And the weightless environment is one in which a person is very much deprived of contact. They're deprived of contact with their surroundings, deprived of tactile experience. And there is a need to communicate to cinema audiences a kind of tangible intangibility. An on-screen character's lack of tactile experience, such as lack of contact with the surface, plays an important role in communicating that sense of being weightless. So in short, a state of suspense in a void that is conveyed through detachment from the ground is key to communicating the feeling of being weightless. And therefore I argue that that detachment from surrounding objects includes detachment from clothes. So clothing needs to be shown to detach from the body, to float around the body, to separate from the body and not to hang on it, if a film is to authentically depict weightlessness and if filmmakers want to express that tactile sensation of being in space. Visible evidence of weightlessness comes often in the form of defamiliarization of familiar experiences, unexpected behaviors of familiar materials like liquid, kind of pooling and undulating and floating spheres of liquid as opposed to liquid filling a vessel, flames diffusing into balls instead of kind of reaching upwards. And astronauts kind of experience constantly being surprised by their surroundings and always constantly feeling this sense of awe and wonder at the fact that familiar things are just behaving in completely different ways. So there's a kind of magic to the way that materials behave in space, and that's something that we might want to capture on film. Is that kind of magic of or spectacle of things going where in unpredictable ways and behaving in unpredictable ways. And I think that defamiliarization should be one of the central pleasures of viewing weightlessness, not experiencing weightlessness, but seeing it on screen. I'd argue that distortion of cloth is one of those things that needs to be on that list of things that behave in interesting ways in space. Because it is a very familiar thing. You know, we come into contact with cloth every day. We are familiar with its behavior. And it would be interesting to see that defamiliarized. So there are various things that, various observations that suggest that when we're designing costume for the weightless environment, we need to consider. Firstly, I think we need to consider the extent to which the relationship between clothes and the body contributes to the haptic visuality of film, and accordingly depict the separation of clothes and the body that occurs in weightlessness. Secondly, I think we need to consider the desire for weightlessness to be visibly evidenced and defamiliarized by loose-fitting, free-flowing materials. And so we must depict the distortion of cloth, not just skin-tight clothes, but cloth that is seen to distort in ways that it doesn't do on Earth. Thirdly, we need to consider the extent to which some off-the-shelf earthwear, so I say earthwear, clothes that were designed for Earth gravity, polo shirts and so on, like astronauts currently wear, is possibly not necessarily appropriate for the dressing of actors in space, because it's awkward and visually unappealing. It kind of floats up in ways you don't necessarily want it to float in. You need to consider the impact of weightlessness on those everyday garments and think maybe we need to design something specifically for weightlessness. So there is new knowledge that costume designers need to have. I think that's that main third point actually, is there's knowledge that doesn't exist in the design of earthwear that needs to be in the toolkit of costume designers who are designing for space. And then lastly, we also need to consider that costumes might appear on screen at very different angles to how we might encounter them on Earth. And so designers need to think about angles of a costume that they don't normally think about. Think about how you might want to expose, or what would happen if you expose those different angles that you don't normally expect to see. Decide whether to enhance those parts of a garment in a way that you wouldn't normally enhance them. And think about what it might look like from above or below, or from all sorts of different angles, as those angles are very likely to be seen on the screen. So those various different observations suggest that when you're designing costume for weightlessness, we need to think about the extent to which the relationship between clothes and the body contributes to the impression of weightlessness and the importance of that immersion. Opportunities for defamiliarization, exploiting those distortions, and looking at those angles. And I think that's actually my last slide. There you go. Questions?
Thank you very much, Barbara. Very good. If people want to
turn your cameras on and
rejoin us with videos and mics, that would be lovely. And if you want to stop sharing your screen, Barbara, so we can see.
Yeah.
Fab. Thank you. Fantastic. Brilliant case studies. I love your case study choices. I think it shows
there's no real option, to be honest.
Yeah.
I can only options.
But they are. I like how varied they are, for sure. Okay, who wants to kick us off? Who has a question?
Kim's got a hand up.
It's not a question. Thanks, Barbara. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. That was great. It's not a question so much as an observation. I was thinking that weightlessness isn't always about authenticity in films, in the sense that it has different meanings in films. So, you know, I was thinking about films where cyborgification is the issue, you know, fitting the human body for new environments, and then, you know, other films where imminent death or the horrors of isolation are the sort of meaning, or you know, 2001, where Kubrick was all about, you know, the delights of technological progress, and so it was just an observation really, that the meaning of weightlessness is not necessarily always about authenticity. Sometimes it's used generically in different ways to have different connotations. That was just my thought.
Yeah, no, and that's something that I'm very much interested in, although I did talk a lot about authenticity today, actually, the creative potential of the weightless environment is very interesting, and the potential to engage with the effects of weightlessness on costume in ways that aren't about authenticity, and aren't, in environments that aren't necessarily supposed to be in space.
Yes.
I think there's a huge amount of potential there to just create the weightlessness effect without making direct reference to weightlessness.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks.
I can see Andrew's got his hand up.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I can immediately see an opportunity to subvert here. I was just wondering, amongst the examples you showed where we're taking a slightly more a positive approach to what space means, future exploration, whatever it might be, I was wondering if you had a Charlie Chaplin in a weightless environment, what's the first thing they would do? And I think they would experiment with all of those textures, all of those shapes, all of those senses, and obviously in whatever story it would come around to doing something naughty, I don't know, sorting out the bully in the spaceship by doing something to the fabric. And I think there you'd get, I'm sure comedians would do a glorious investigation of what personal advantage could they find from textures, clothing, all those things in space, while we're slightly thinking along a slightly more noble line. They'd be going, well, I know what will happen if I untuck so-and-so's shirt at this point. They'll be humiliated.
So many opportunities for physical comedy.
I think it's endless. No, I just wanted to put a quick subversion in there.
Yeah, I'm now imagining all sorts of rather wonderful scenarios, and I think somebody needs to do it.
Okay, we'll do it this afternoon.
Yes, please do.
We'll get the flight booked. I can see Tim's got his hand up.
Hi, Barbara. I thought that was really interesting. And I just found myself wondering about your personal area of specific interest. You seem to discuss two separate things. One is the depiction of earthware in space, and the other one is designing for weightlessness. And I just was wondering what interests you in terms of production issues. Unless you get onto the vomit comet like they do in those movies, it's really hard to depict earthware in space because it's just really hard to do. I mean, the whole thing could be animated in CGI or something like that. Well, I think that's one of the reasons.
Don't do it.
I know, because it's very hard and complicated and time consuming and expensive, which is one of the reasons why one of the solutions people go for are the very tight fitting clothes, precisely because it doesn't show. But if in the future, one could imagine I mean, I've never thought about this before. One could imagine in a century's time, after 100 years of spacefaring, designers would have had decades of designing specifically for weightless environments. And that could be interesting. Is that something that interests you as in design terms? There's
an awful lot of different strands to this project. That kind of touch on stuff that you've said there, and there's possibly a step-by-step process, because we'll obviously the environment is going to change over the next few decades. At the moment, our interest is going to be in trying to predict and simulate the effects of weightlessness when it's not as readily available as it might be in the future, whereas in the future obviously we'll possibly be designing prototypes actually in the weightless environment, and it'll be much easier to just test and do different iterations and make micro adjustments if we're in that environment. At the moment, it is not possible to design something, take it up into space, think it's not quite working, let's tweak it and try again, We can't do those little many iterations on the design process. So emphasis needs to be on analysing and understanding the effects of weightlessness, using the material we've got, more effectively simulating it, and being able to predict or anticipate how weightlessness is going to affect clothes before we actually get up there into space. So some of this project more broadly is actually looking at the extent to which we can or can't authentically replicate the effects of weightlessness on clothing. And once we've got all that data and the methods of simulating it accurately, we can then start to design for the weightless environment using that knowledge.
It's just very quickly, I think sort of going forward, there's going to be, certainly in the short term, two sorts of people in space. So you're going to have, people who are working in space, who will need to have,
Uniforms.
utilitarian garments. But there'll also be the super rich who are going there for leisure, and they'll want to dress up for it.
Yeah.
And rather like, celebrities have got their designer masks in the COVID environment, Lady Gaga. One could immediately imagine some quite elaborate weightless outfits that are being worn by the...
And that, I think, is probably the biggest target market of my research more broadly, is space tourists. The commercial space industry at the moment has kind of concluded, and I think wrongly concluded, that space tourists will want to dress up as astronauts, will want flight suits that look like what we might consider to be space workwear. But actually, I think if you look at what people are choosing to do when they go up on zero gravity flights, they're choosing to do things like let their hair out, which suggests that they don't want to just float around. They also want their clothes or their hair to float around. They want to visibly evidence the effects of weightlessness on their bodies and the things that are around their bodies, which to my mind means that they probably don't want to be wearing skin tight flight suits. They might want to wear clothes that more interestingly behave in the weightless environment and directly kind of respond to it in unusual, unexpected ways.
They'll need changing rooms when they get up there. They need bigger spaceships.
There's a whole other bit of research on how difficult it is to undress in space. Very difficult. It takes two people.
Gonna need a bigger boat, Tim.
Yeah.
I think Lubo had his hand up first. Lubo and then Tony, I think we're on.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, Barbara. I'm always fascinated with these kind of talks. Some time ago when I was teaching computer science in another institution, I had a master's student who developed a project on modeling flags and canopies, and they could switch wind or gravity on and off, and you could get this cloth and its impression, how it behaves, and you can actually click on the cloth and drag it and do all sorts of things. So is that something that you've come across?
This is something that, and David might need to come in here, but as I understand it at the moment, we've got two bits of knowledge that exist in two different places. In the fashion industry, and particularly in clothing simulations that are used within the fashion industry, there is knowledge about simulating how cloth drapes different kinds of cloth. Whereas over here somewhere else, in animation and in other fields, there is knowledge about how to simulate the effects of weightlessness on cloth more generically. And what we don't have is those two bits of information working together and coming together, because what we actually need is the information about how weightlessness affects cloth generally, and the more specific data about different types of cloth and different thicknesses and different shear values and all of that, to give us a more accurate depiction of how particular kinds of clothes and particular kinds of fabrics will actually behave in weightlessness.
So this has all been resolved. I mean, you can simulate the physics of cloth very, very easily by using almost like a kind of network of points and assigning physics properties to that net to each point, and then linking the points.
You, my friends on Facebook, will have seen my weightless cloth body error.
I was just
I made a little animation that accidentally turned a body into cloth and made it weightless, and it floated around.
I just thought that this could be an experimental method for you to check what happens when you design something, then you test it. It's like an experimental approach to design.
actually, Barbara, that has been solved in this particular case.
This is what I want people to tell me.
Yes, I think in 3 years
because
ago,
I don't know exactly how much has been achieved.
3 years ago, I went to a talk by this chief technology officer of DreamWorks, and he was talking about the distributed computing platform.
Yeah.
And they no longer have lots of animators. They have a few animators and an awful lot of computer science PhDs. And by using sort of second order differential equations and stuff, which I don't pretend to understand, but Lubo probably will, you know, they're able to give animators the ability to manipulate very complex parametric spaces in real time. So they sort of perform the animation. And they spun off that system as a commercial arm. And one of their first sales was to a scarf manufacturer who actually used it to design, that they could design scarves and see how the fabrics were going to react before they'd even made a sample, you know. So
and that I'm aware that knowledge exists within the fashion industry, but it needs to be paired with other knowledge about simulating weightlessness. If it has been done, if all of that information has come together, I'm hoping somebody will tell me about it, because I'm not in the field of computer science or digital animation. But if it hasn't been done, this is what I'm trying to find out, then there's a scope for a research project in there. Tony's got a hand up.
I think Tony was, Tony was next.
Hi there, Barbara. Great, thanks again for that. That's been really good. Actually, I'm just going to quickly pick up on what Ian was just saying there as well, because I've sort of bridged over here into the media group. However, I have been involved in this sort of technology for a long time, going back to '93 as well, and certainly cloth deformation modelling is there. There is kind of that knowledge. It very much resides within the CAD/CAM specialists within the fashion industry as well. So you can certainly bridge over some of that knowledge.
That's the bridge is the thing that's needed.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are, you know, there's Lectra, Gerber, and there's various other sort of
there's loads of it, and it's very extensive in the fashion industry. They just haven't put it in the context of weightlessness yet.
No, and also it's the delay in being able to use this sort of knowledge for visualization purposes as well, whether they're in sort of immersive environments, in sort of weightless environments, or whatever those environments may be as well. However, I'm just going to kind of bring it back to some of the notes that I've written down as well. And I think, because obviously I think you mentioned right at the beginning that there was obviously this whole area is incredibly complex from a fashion point of view, but also from a film point of view as well. And of course, obviously, with the fashion, the direction of fashion and costume is slightly, well, obviously, the direction of fashion is slightly different to the direction of costume as well, because costume is obviously something created for a particular purpose, whether it's kind of to simulate reality or whether it's to not simulate reality as well, or for, you know, other means. However, fashion obviously has a track of history that relates to it as well. So the function of clothing normally has evolved over a period of time in order to look at the function of fashion, the aesthetic of fashion, and then obviously we challenge that through the innovations, and innovations obviously come through via material development and processes as well. So I think today you seem to be talking a lot more about costume, rather than obviously fashion. So I've just wondered if you'd started to consider bringing it back to fashion. You've mentioned the functionality of materials and how they react in a weightless environment, and of course there is that debate, and I think there's a very valid debate there as well. It's like, you know, if you're caught in a gust of wind, you don't want your garment to sort of fly up, you know, and you want to be able to sort of manipulate it and put it down to where it should be, and that is, I think, a very sensible kind of debate. However, of course, there is the suppression of clothing within fashion as well, so clothing that is specifically designed to be close to the body, you know, and I suppose that's why we do see so much close-fitting clothing in these types of environments as well.
Yeah, well, there are all sorts of safety reasons as well why it tends to be close-fitting, and practical reasons.
Completely, and I think there's also two other kind of aspects here as well. One is the construction and production of clothing for function, survival. You know, it has to perform a function, otherwise you could effectively lose your life if it wasn't functioning correctly. Then there's the development and the construction and design of clothing for purely aesthetics and fashion as well, and how that kind of is actually going to react within the weightless environment as well. And I think it's also about the development of materials but also the layering of clothing as well. I mean, and also the how do we launder the material in these weightless environments? How do we treat underwear? Well, these are, if we're thinking about, are we replicating life on Earth, or are we trying to think about a new life, a new way of living as well? So I think there's some interesting points of debate there.
And there are all sorts of other things, like when we come to the laundry question at the moment, they don't wash clothes because they just have to choose fabrics that will last a while without smelling. And then you start thinking, well, maybe clothes need to be modular, so you can replace bits because you can't wash them, and maybe and there's the weight of clothes and the cost of getting the weight up to space as well. So there's all sorts of other considerations that become part of this. And I think what you alluded to there also was the distinction between work wear for astronauts and leisure wear for
absolutely
tourists.
Yes, and also obviously there's obviously materials. The technological advance of materials actually would perhaps inform your research incredibly.
There has been an awful lot of it, and actually one of the reasons I've steered clear of textiles research is because there's been so much already into textiles for space. A lot of it is about textile technology, but then there's also research into flammability and sweat wicking capabilities of clothes so that they can wear them for a long time. There's a huge amount of research already in that sphere about textiles for space. So I feel that I'm kind of piggybacking onto that, or else working in parallel with that other research.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did I see Stephen? Did you want to say something? Oh, you're muted, Stephen.
No, I was just waving my pen around. Forgive me.
Just waving. Okay. Anybody else?
David.
So I had a question about, I was intrigued by your suggestion about different angles and seeing the shoulder seams, and that sent me on one of the sort of holy grails of animation and texturing is being able to hide all your seams. So I was wondering how you thought that seams were going to be resolved.
Seams, I wouldn't want to hide the seams. I think the seams are important, particularly when we're thinking about simulations, because seams are going to be one of the ways in which the movement of the fabric is going to be constrained. So I think seams play a vital role in the behavior of the garments, and you could probably do interesting things with that. So it's not just about seeing the seams because of the angle, but also the effect that little bit of slight rigidity has on the behavior of everything else surrounding it and attached to it.
A slight follow-on question was, do you think shoulder pads are going to come back?
For space, there might be padding all over the place in space to stop you from floating away and into we actually had a fashion student when they were doing this weightlessness project a couple of years ago who did look at designing spacewear with just pads everywhere, because they were worried about how often you might bang into things. And basically it was a suit that just was full of lots of airbags.
Very good, thank you.
Anyone else? Andrew, you're muted.
I don't want to end on a tacky note, but I'm going to. I was just wondering, as we were listen, we all go down the noble route first. We're intelligent people. We want to think that the future is going to be in some way positive, beneficial, something better than ourselves. However, if I was, say, a Rupert Murdoch character, if the ability to broadcast from space becomes viable because of the cost, because I already own half of the satellites, this, that, and the other, I can imagine a sudden scramble for ownership of the in-space brand to the lowest common denominator, much as he did when he started his very successful development of cable channels, before most of us had even heard of cable. He was bringing great shows such as Topless Darts to the world, these really important shows. And I have a horrible feeling that people like that would get involved into this world, because obviously there's going to be a marketing opportunity for anything you do. And rather than, you know, and I don't, you know, and I could think it all just going down a lowest common denominator end. So, you know, all the smutty comedy about material, about fabrics, about people, about what you're wearing in space at the moment. Imagine a sort of living hell of the lowest common denominator of cheap lifestyle programming. But you could do anything from space. You know, in space gives you a sales point for about a year. A circus in space, darts in space, pub quiz in space.
We're already beginning to see that emerge in the industry. You've got, you know, people who are looking at designing sexy suits for sexy times in space that connect two people to each other. And,
oh God, I was joking.
And how whiskey glasses are going to work in space and how cocktail glasses are going to work in space. So yeah, you will get that. But also, I mean, from an ethical standpoint, I'm very aware that I am just kind of sidestepping all the ecological concerns. This is not sustainable. I'm very much thinking about a luxury market. Yeah, and a lot of it is going to be about spectacle in a lowest common denominator kind of way, I suspect, once we get there. I mean, it'll take a while to get there, but it will eventually.
It's astonishing how far your subject is spinning now, isn't it? It's enormous. It's enormous. Brilliant. Thank you.
I think Ivan had a hand up.
He did, yeah.
Yeah. Just occurred to me, I was watching a lot of sort of mid-20th century films where they were doing their first sort of underwater shooting and stuff, and I wondered if the behaviour of cloth in zero gravity is comparable to the way cloth behaves underwater.
It is, except that there is drag.
Yeah.
So filming clothes underwater gives you a little bit of a sense of what they will look like in weightlessness. And astronauts train underwater because it is comparable, but drag creates a surprising amount of movement. And if you're used to seeing clothes underwater and then you go and look at clothes just hung in space, it's surprising how still the clothes in space are compared to the clothes underwater. And you almost think that it's a still image rather than a video, unless somebody's actually coming and poking them. So yes, underwater can be used to an extent, and we did do this with the fashion students. We took some little mannequins and put them underwater with their clothes on to take photos of them. It's interesting to see what happens underwater, and that does give you a sense of how unpredictably clothes behave underwater, which in turn gives you a sense of how unpredictably they might behave in space. It's a satisfactory but imperfect simulation, basically.
Because in some ways it's almost the opposite, isn't it? Because water's incredibly dense and it has movement and eddies and currents and so on, whereas space is, yeah. It's
interesting to look at underwater photography and how it's been used for creative purposes, and that I think is something we can learn from, because when you look at underwater films and underwater photography, we don't just use the underwater environment for authenticity's sake. We don't just film divers underwater. We also film models in ball gowns underwater because of the potential for creative engagement with that environment, and I think that's what we will eventually see in space as well.
Just a side point, really. Quite early on in your presentation, you talked about the consciousness of the spacesuit wearer of their own sort of body noises and the noise. If you're actually spacewalking, can you hear inside your own costume? Because there is no noise, as I understand it.
There's no noise outside of the spacesuit. Inside, it's quite loud.
You would hear it.
There's, I mean, obviously you've got your own breath, but you've also got the circulation system that is cooling you, so you are aware of how the suit is preserving your body. Quite often, apparently, you become aware of your heartbeat as well, partly because of the contrast between this noise and the silence that's going on out there outside of the suit. there's actually a whole load of other really interesting things that I could get into about dislocation of senses, because some of the sounds that you hear close to your head are actually not originating from here. They are projected from somewhere else. So some of it might be sounds that you're getting fed through your earphones. And there have been suggestions that if you are in a spacesuit on, say, the surface of Mars, one of the ways in which we might need to change the design of the spacesuit there is to put the effectively put the ears on the soles of the feet, because sound doesn't travel through the atmosphere in Mars, it only travels through solid objects. So if you want to be able to hear the noise of a landslide or some potential threat going on in the environment, you're going to hear that through the ground, not through the air. And so they are thinking about dislocating the sense of hearing from here to down in your feet.
Sounds like a project for Stellark.
Well, yeah.
Somebody grafted an ear onto his arm, hasn't he?
It's a really interesting thing, the senses and how they are dislocated but also contained in that helmet. And yeah, I'm doing another paper on that.
Kind of built from that, when you were talking earlier about that kind of that sense of claustrophobia from kind of being in the helmet and that kind of sensory, sort of a cross between sensory deprivation but at the same time and kind of overwhelming awareness of your own being and the sounds kind of emanating from you. And it was making me think very much about genre. Obviously your examples are not all kind of science fiction related, but it was making me think about sci-fi, and then when you talked about it, also making me think about horror and about that kind of disassociation with the body and that kind of uncanniness that you must get from kind of wearing something that you're not feeling on yourself. So as cloth is moving away from your body, it's a sort of almost a sort of a disassociative kind of process that perhaps fuels those kind of uncanny themes in sci-fi and horror. And it was making me think about kind of body horror. And it was funny that Ivan mentioned kind of using kind of underwater sequences as well in a similar kind of way, whether we can use that in a measurable way, because it was making me think of recent horror films that I'd seen set underwater, and Sea Fever in particular, that use that kind of idea that you're very kind of isolated and turn sound in on itself and so on. So I'm sorry that turned into one of those, this isn't really a question.
If you read some of the personal accounts of choreographers and dancers who experience weightlessness, they talk about not really being able to tell where the body ends and the environment begins. They don't know where the limits of their own bodies are anymore.
Yes.
And they have to completely relearn how to be in their bodies in that environment. And obviously as dancers, they're very aware of their own physicality. So there's that is quite fascinating, but also quite terrifying. And the whole of space is terrifying. And being that isolated, imagine being in the middle of the Atlantic on a raft, but multiplied a million times over.
Yes, terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying.
Both options, neither option for me. Thanks very much. I think Tim has another question. Thanks.
Just a couple of points that have just struck me listening to this very interesting conversation. I read or heard something once that I thought was quite interesting with regard to space suits for spacewalking, that they should be conceived of less as clothing and more as
individual spaceships.
Yes,
yeah.
That you wear. And the other thing about fashion in space is it seems to me it's going to have something to do with, or be a function of, the amount of space within whichever environment you're with, i.e. inside the craft.
Yeah.
Because to exploit the wonderful potential of weightlessness,
you need to be able
to float about.
But
spacecrafts are usually quite tight spaces.
Yeah.
Maybe little Scylla all around the thing that kind of shimmy as you move about. I don't know. But and the other thing is that the people would have to change. I'm pretty sure you have to wear the precious suit on takeoff and landing.
Only just in case.
Oh really? Well, that's a big in case though, isn't it? So,
well, a lot of the commercial providers that intend to intend to do mass tourism, or tend to do these large scale flights for tourists, are now kind of shifting their focus a little bit, because they had two options. Either they could just dress everybody in a spacesuit all the time just in case of depressurization, or they could do what the aviation industry does, which is rely on the craft itself for protection and increasing the safety of that and reducing the potential risk of depressurization. And that's kind of the direction they're moving in now, which means there will be more of a shift towards looking at clothes rather than flight suits.
It's interesting.
But at the moment, they do all wear flight suits just in case.
Goes back to the dressing room. Dressing room in space.
Dressing room, yeah. It takes several people to put on a spacesuit in space, because the bits just float around, the boots fly off.
Dressing room and the butler.
Becomes a problem. And they have to attach the spacesuit to the wall to climb into it, because otherwise that will fly around. So there's all sorts of, dressing and undressing in space is interesting and different. In fact, there's going to be all sorts of interesting challenges there. And I think this is one of the reasons why there's a case to be made for modular clothing, because it's probably easier to just stick bits to yourself than to try and slide in. But I also think more broadly, there is a really interesting relationship between gravity and dressing and undressing, because we dress up, we dress and undress vertically, with this clothes fall onto us and off of us.
Are you also thinking about, sorry, I don't mean to monopolize. Are you also thinking about low gravity clothing? Because they're now talking about building a village on the moon, starting within the decade.
Yeah.
And so 1/6 gravity.
And as an extension of that, we need to think about a lot of the suborbital flights and short distance flights that are going to be offered to people, which will be half an hour long. And you'll go from being on Earth and needing clothes that work in Earth gravity to needing those same clothes to work in weightlessness. And then, so they need to be quite adaptable, clothes that will work in multiple different environments. And if you're on a zero gravity flight now, you actually get periods of different, you get a period of moon gravity and a period of Mars gravity and then a period of weightlessness. And so you do go through all these various different gravitational environments. And yeah, in a lot of these cases, you will, if you are designing costumes or clothes for those environments, you do need to think about how they will behave in a variety of different environments, not just in the one weightless environment.
Very interesting stuff. And manufacturing clothing in space.
Yes, there is an astronaut who has tried sewing a quilt in space, and she says it's difficult. Because again, sewing is something that relies very much on gravity, just holding the fabric under its own weight on the surface.
Marvelous stuff. Marvelous stuff.
Thanks, Tim. Anybody else? Any final questions for Barbara? Well, in that case, I'm sure everybody will join me in thanking Barbara for a fantastic, very interesting talk. Really, really great. Really enjoyed that. Thanks so much, Barbara. Really glad that we could find a space for you. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. It's nice to have a distraction from all of the,
the
world that's exploding in AQ then.
Thank you so much, and lots of thanks and lovely comment in the chat as well, so do stick around.
Oh, I haven't seen that. I'll look at
take a look if you get a chance. Yeah,
hang on, Stephen's got his hand up.
Oh, Stephen.
Oh yeah, just to remind everybody that next week, I think on the 18th, we've got the TBAD talk, and I noticed that it's on Grace's research in relation to haptic experience and design, so not a huge leap from many of the issues that Barbara has been delighting us with today. Put that in the diaries. That's it.
I see in the chat that we've got an MA student here. Welcome. Thank you very much. It's nice to have students of these talks.
It's lovely to have
Absolutely.
students here.
Michael.
Really pleased to see people here.
And I see you're doing textiles, so brilliant. Let me know if you want to have a chat.
Thanks very much, everybody. I'm gonna stop the recording now. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.